In the beginning, Morgoth was described as the most powerful of the Ainur, so much so that his individual power matched or was even greater than all of the other Valar combined. But thousands of years later, in the final moments of the War of Wrath, Morgoth was a mere shadow of his former self, begging for mercy as he was dragged into captivity once again. So, what happened? How did Morgoth go from being the most powerful being on Arda to a pathetic coward whose power had fallen beneath that of even some of his own servants? When the Ainur first arrived on Arda, Morgoth immediately made his intentions clear. Arda would be his dominion, and when that was rejected, he immediately went to war with the other Valar. This is a conflict simply known as the First War. As the Valar attempted to shape Arda, Morgoth would always be there to ruin and undo their works. In this conflict, Morgoth is stated as long having the upper hand, until the arrival of Tulkas the Strong, a Valar who was entirely dedicated to physical strength and war. At Tulkas' arrival, Morgoth and his servants would flee Arda for a time. This allowed for a golden era known as the Spring of Arda, a time where the world was free from the evil of Morgoth's influence. This did not last. Morgoth and his servants returned, created the fortress of Utumno, and from there, Morgoth's influence would once again seep into Arda itself. To make matters worse, Morgoth launched a surprise assault on the two lamps, Ormal and Illuin, destroying them, causing a cataclysm that once again reshaped the world. Unable to match Morgoth's power, the Valar would retreat to the western continent of Aman, creating the Blessed Realm of Valinor. This led to a stalemate between Morgoth and the Valar. Morgoth dominated Middle-earth, while the Valar were unassailable on Valinor. However, when the elves awoke at Cuiviénen, the Valar realised that they had to act if they were to save Ilúvatar's children from Morgoth's tyranny. The following war was called the War of the Powers, and it once again caused massive amounts of damage to the world and its continents. But in the end, the Valar were victorious. Utumno was mostly destroyed, and Tulkas managed to wrestle Morgoth to the ground, chaining him with Anganor. Alright, this isn't a history lesson video, but the aforementioned information is important if one wants to understand the mechanics behind Morgoth's gradual weakening during his time on Arda. Tolkien explains some of this in the Silmarillion, but the real treasure trove of information is in the Myths Transformed section of Morgoth's Ring, the 10th volume in the history of Middle-earth. This is the same section that describes many of the differences between Morgoth and Sauron, so it's done a lot of heavy lifting for my YouTube channel. In the notes under section 6 of Myths Transformed, Tolkien states that Morgoth must be far more powerful than the rest of the Valar, and even combined, they should not have the strength to subdue him. It even states that when the Valar attacked Morgoth and Utumno during the War of the Powers, they didn't actually believe that they could win. Instead, the attack was meant to be diversionary, keeping Morgoth distracted enough to allow the Valar to remove the elves from his sphere of influence. But the Valar were wrong. They were able to defeat Morgoth and his forces, and Utumno was mostly destroyed. So what happened here? Well, this is where Tolkien draws attention to the fact that even during these early days, Morgoth had already started weakening himself. This was due to two reasons. One, Morgoth had dispersed much of his power into Arda itself. This is where the name of Morgoth's Ring comes from. Sauron poured his power into the rings, Morgoth poured his power into Arda, hence Arda was Morgoth's Ring. The reason Morgoth did this was to corrupt the works of the Valar, and essentially turn the world against them. The process of this is really well described in the Silmarillion. And though the Valar knew naught of it as yet, nonetheless the evil of Melkor and the blight of his hatred flowed out thence, and the spring of Arda was marred. Green things fell sick and rotted, and rivers were choked with weeds and slime, and fens were made rank and poisonous, the breeding place of flies, and forests grew dark and perilous, the haunts of fear, and beasts became monsters of horn and ivory, and dyed the earth with blood. Then the Valar knew indeed that Melkor was at work again, and they sought for his hiding place. This is the concept of Arda marred, the idea that Morgoth poured much of his power into the world itself, permanently staining it and anything that lived on it. Once again, I'll use a quote from the man himself, this time from Myths Transformed. To gain domination over Arda, Morgoth had let most of his being pass into the physical constituents of the earth, hence all things that were born on earth and lived on it and by it, beasts or plants or incarnate spirits, were liable to be stained. The second reason Morgoth's native power was declining was because he was imbuing his power into his servants. Tolkien describes this as giving them the power of multiplication and recuperation. Basically, even if Morgoth isn't present, creatures such as orcs would gather again, even without being given specific orders. To once again quote Tolkien, part of his native creative power has gone out into making an independently evil growth out of his control. And some of this growth was out of his control. As Nature of Middle-earth told us, in the First and early Second Age, there were Eastern orcs that had grown powerful and they operated entirely beyond Morgoth's control and originally even laughed at Sauron when he tried to recruit them. And while never explicitly confirmed, it makes one wonder if Morgoth's further creations continued to weaken him, creations such as trolls, dragons, and then the deadly winged dragons. It also might explain how Morgoth was able to feed and grow his armies inside Angband, despite it being a hellish dungeon in a frozen wasteland. Perhaps Morgoth used his own power to create food for his soldiers, or perhaps his very power sustained them. Regardless, in the War of the Powers, because Morgoth's strength was now greatly dispersed amongst his servants, when the Valar were able to defeat them piecemeal and isolate them from Morgoth, Morgoth now actually lacked the strength to stop them, hence Tolkas being able to defeat him and take him prisoner. In Myths Transformed, Tolkien goes into further depth about this encounter. He says that both Morgoth and Manwë were amazed. Manwë was amazed at seeing how far Morgoth had already fallen, and Morgoth was amazed at the same thing, from his own point of view. The moment of realization for Morgoth is when Manwë is no longer simply daunted by his gaze, because Manwë's personal strength has now eclipsed his own. Tolkien actually says that this could have been reversible, that Morgoth could have regained his former strength, but Morgoth's own lust to dominate creatures prevents this. Thus, when he returns to Middle-earth after his captivity, he gets straight back to doing the same thing he was doing before. We're also told that Morgoth intentionally made himself incarnate, essentially locking himself to a body the same way Gandalf was, in an attempt to better interact with and master the physical world. In doing this, he lost a great amount of his original angelic powers, but to compensate that, he could do more damage to the physical world. We see this in the War of the Powers and in the War of Wrath. Both of these actions only serve to accelerate Morgoth's weakening. We can see this happen bit by bit through the Silmarillion. At the start of the War of the Jewels, Morgoth still has some powers that are native to the Ainur. For example, when he corrupts men into his service, he takes a beautiful form. But by the time of the Dagor Bragollach, he's locked into the form of a Dark Lord, and while he's still a force to be reckoned with, his duel with Fingolfin shows just how far he's fallen. Although Fingolfin was a powerful elf, Morgoth used to be able to take on all of the Valar at once, but in their duel, he's wounded 8 times and left with a permanent limp. He no longer has the ability to regenerate his form. Tolkien explains, in Myths Transformed, that a major reason why Morgoth never left Angband after that was because he was aware of this weakness and had developed a fear of injury and death. We also see Morgoth's fall in other ways. For example, his gaze was once powerful enough to cow Manwë, the second mightiest of the Valar, but after the Nenea Fanoidiad, he can't even cow Hurin. During the quest for the Silmaril, he's put to sleep by Luthien. While Luthien is a powerful sorceress, keep in mind that only a short time ago, she was almost overwhelmed by Sauron and was probably only saved by the presence of Huan. This leads me back to a hint that I dropped in my introduction, that Morgoth had become weaker than even some of his own servants. While we're unsure if this overlapped at the end of the First Age, Tolkien tells us that, quote, Sauron was greater, effectively, in the Second Age than Morgoth at the end of the First. Basically, Morgoth had dispersed so much of his power that his own native strength at the end of the First Age was less than that of Sauron's in the Second Age. This is the Sauron that was defeated by Elendil and Gil-galad, so it's possible that even a mere mortal could have dealt Morgoth a lethal blow during the War of Wrath. Certainly, no Valar were required. Eonwë, a Maiar, was capable of defeating Morgoth at this time. And yes, I'm sure some people are wondering, well, hold on, surely that means Sauron could have overthrown Morgoth at this time. If he could, we don't know, and that's a topic for a different video. All that being said, while Morgoth did gradually weaken himself throughout the ages, to the point of where he would have been barely recognisable, you would be hard-pressed to argue that it was for nothing. Morgoth's mark on the world, Arden Mard, was the source of the decay that would set into Middle-earth, gradually weakening people such as the Elves and the Númenóreans, and as said earlier, no one who lived there, bird, beast, or man, was free from the taint Morgoth left behind, and it would be a source of reoccurring evil for ages to come. While Morgoth went from powerful to weak, his power didn't just disappear. It existed inside everything, and that wouldn't change until the world was eventually remade. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I've been accused of being too harsh on Morgoth in the past, so I hope the start of the video makes it clear that, yes, Morgoth was the guy at the beginning of Arthur, and if that same Morgoth was around during the War of the Jewels, well, the Noldor would have been crushed instantly. But that's the nature of evil in Tolkien's world. It's ultimately self-defeating, and Morgoth's weakening of his self to fuel his ideas of dominion is a perfect example of that. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you want to roleplay as Morgoth and gradually weaken yourself, you can do that through the power of cigarettes.